So, Andrew Clennell has the details on Albo's "I'll see you down the road in 2050, zero emissions target, but I won't tell you how much it costs. And if you don't agree with us, doing what we're doing now is apparently 20 times more expensive than the number we're not going to tell you." Have a look.
Federal Labor leader Anthony Albanese will announce a Labor climate policy involving zero net emissions by 2050. In doing so, he is adopting a target Prime Minister Scott Morrison has so far been reluctant to adopt. The decision on the matter came in shadow ministry in January. A couple of MPs dissented in Joel Fitzgibbon and Matt Keogh in terms of raising concerns about the policy. However, it eventually passed the shadow ministry unanimously. Anthony Albanese first flagged this sort of policy in an interview with Sky News in January.
One of the things that we're likely to do is to announce a longer-term target before we announce, because by definition,
2050?
You're able
Zero
to
net
do
emissions,
that.
2050?
Well, we'll wait and we'll make our announcements at an appropriate time.
In adopting the policy, Mr Albanese is adopting a policy the Business Council of Australia has pushed for and several state governments have adopted.
All right, let's talk about this. Nicholas, hold your water. Bronwyn, seriously. 20 times question mark equals Liberal position. Trust us, it's 12 elections away, is the Labor position.
Well, this is straight socialist policy. It has got no benefit for the Australian people. It's got no benefit for this country. It is designed to de-skill us, and the Prime Minister must not listen. He mustn't listen to the socialist rantings. He mustn't listen to the ABC. He mustn't listen to the greenies. He's got to listen to people like you and you.
God love you.
Alan Jones, Peter Credlin, people who took good, sensible sense about what the Australian people want. That last election was called the climate change election. And what happened? We heard the same rubbish that Albo's just putting up now, and the Australian people said no. We don't want it.
Yep.
No.
Well, even...
How many times do you have to try and spell the word for the man? N-O.
Yeah, but also, I mean, it's this thing where, you know, Nicholas, I mean, it was the Howard-Rudd election of 2007 where there was a fight about whether to sign Kyoto or not, which ultimately is measured...
It had been signed. Rudd was on about ratification.
Oh, sure. But I'm saying, 2007, this big debate, you get measured whether you did it or not in 2020. Paris is about 2030. How does 2050 start to come into the equation, Nicholas, when we haven't even started the 10-year run towards the next goal?
Well, it's actually pretty important, Paul, because Australia's going through a transition off fossil fuel onto renewables.
Not.
We're transitioning towards being carbon neutral, Bronwyn. You can keep banging on all you like, but the rest of the world's moving on. So, for example, countries like the United Kingdom, led by Tory Prime Minister Boris Johnson, have committed to zero emissions or net carbon neutral by 2050. Now, why is that important? Hang on.
Do you know what biomass is? It's wood.
Okay.
They're cutting down trees and burning it, and that counts as no emissions. I mean, the whole thing is a fallacy.
I'll be very patient. I'll try and keep going. Listen carefully, please, Bronwyn. The reason why it's important to have that long-term target in place,
Nicholas. I take back all the things I said nicely about you.
It's because the transition is a long-term one, and things like power stations cost many billions of dollars. So if you're investing in a power station, you know it's going to be there for decades. So if you know that we're going to be carbon neutral by 2050, that sends a very strong signal to the market that you shouldn't bother investing in a coal-fired power station, because you're not going to get a proper commercial return on that asset.
But Nicholas...
So that's carbon neutral by 2050. The second policy he's committing to is not doing the Kyoto carryovers. Now, Scott Morrison has been crab walking away from that in recent days. The third policy he's committing to is not giving taxpayer subsidies to coal-fired power stations, and that's just common sense good policy. So I think everything he was announcing was perfectly
paid for windmills
sensible.
And solar.
Okay, but it's this thing, Chris, where, I mean, the politics of this is ludicrous, right? Which is the idea that we can lock governments into things for 2050 that we don't, by the way, about education, about health, about all of these things, right? It's just this fundamental idea. I don't want anyone to be screwing the planet, all right? But I also know that if you only produce 1 and a bit % of the problem, the most you can do is fix 1 and a bit % of the problem. And even if you doubled and 1 trillion trees and all of this business, what, you'll get to 2%?
Labor, if they go down this path, and if Scott Morrison sticks to rational policy, Labor has just gifted the next election to the coalition. You cannot win with a ridiculous promise like this, because the best interpretation on it possible is that it's just so often the never never that it's meaningless, in which case you just show how you lack substance. But if you say you're going to do this, you have to be answerable for what's going to happen to this economy. And you can't do this without destroying the Australian economy. I mean, this is going to affect transport, it's going to affect agriculture. They'll come from your pets. About 5% of Australians' emissions come from our pets and the pet food industry. They'll come for them. It is so absurd, and that people like Nicholas and these other leftists have been dragged down this great global virtue signalling path, is a great gift to Scott Morrison if he just promises to do the sensible thing. Because the thing here, you mentioned before the Penny Wong grab, we're saying she doesn't know what it'll cost. But it's 20 times cheaper than not acting. Australians are sensible and informed, and they know, because of what you said about our small level of emissions compared to the global total, and the fact that global emissions still are rising dramatically, we know that the cost of Australia not acting is zero.
Correct.
If we don't act, it will make no difference to the climate. If we act, it'll make no difference to the climate. So the only thing at stake here is whether we are doing our bit with a global effort. We will not change the climate. Therefore, if we burden ourselves with additional costs to do more, there will be no benefit for us whatsoever. So it's all cost, no gain. All cost, no benefit.
So, Nicholas,
so logical.
You'll respond in a second.
And Scott Morrison needs to grasp this and have the debate. And just one kicker on this, because it depends a lot on the energy sector, and Labor has had a 50% renewable energy target. South Australia over the past 2 weeks was disconnected from the national grid. So it couldn't have coal-fired power station coming in from Victoria to buttress its large number of wind farms and the like. Do you know how much of its electricity was supplied by wind in that period? It was something like a third. Like 60, waiting on the latest figures, but the amount of gas-fired power it used never fell below 63% in that period, and got as high as 85%.
Yeah.
So I think you'll find it's about 2/3 gas. Well, that's what they want to do that to the whole. They can't do it.
Well,
what they're talking about, they can't do.
Well, where'd your power come from today? 81% coal in New South Wales, 80% coal in Queensland. In Victoria, it was 85% coal. But Nicholas, let's deal with the straight up here, right? Because you can see where I'm going to be coming from as I'm sitting here as a slowly getting fatter and older man for the 2022, 25, 28, 31, 34, 37, 40, 43, 46 and 2049 elections. All right? Just so you know, that's how many elections we've got to go, and this is the logic that your team's going to be putting up.
So,
roll the tape of Penny Wong.
Oh, sorry.
We know from what many people have told us is that it will cost us far more not to act than to act, some 20 times more, according to a recent study. We know that the CSIRO has said if we act on climate change, if we act towards a net zero emissions target, the economy will be bigger and wages will be higher and power prices lower. So next time Scott Morrison says he won't do anything unless he can quantify the costs, I reckon he should be asked, well, what are the costs of the path you're on, Scott Morrison?
Nicholas, how does it work? That question mark versus 20 times question mark.
Paul, you know I love you, mate, and I think Chris Kenny is a very smart guy, but on this topic, you both spew unadulterated garbage, OK? Now, let's just start...
Could be renewable source of energy.
Let's just start with,
absolutely right.
What's the cost of not acting? Well, I think the past summer has given us a pretty good insight.
What a disgrace. So you're saying
Australia,
you're not saying financial costs.
We know in Australia that temperatures are 1.5 degrees above the long-term average, and that has caused record droughts, bushland drying out, and we saw those awful bushfires. So that gives you a sense.
Your problem is
of what
science.
Australia's
You
facing.
just ignore science when you want to. Listen to the scientists.
So why can't Labor give a number? Like, if everyone is all in, why can't you just turn around and say, hey, Australia, here's the deal. We have, we've got to spend $100 billion and it will mean that we become a zero emissions economy. Who's up for it?
And it'll be cooler.
But why can't you say that?
Because he's a common sense denier.
No, because the transition of Australia from fossil fuels to renewables, which is the journey that we must go on, is a huge exercise for our economy, and it's going to take some decades. That's why we've got a 2050 target.
But why can't you put an estimate on it?
It's going to take decades.
Nicholas, we can have a mix, but we need base load. And you're a base load denier, and you're doing the country no good at all.
Base load.
A base load denier. That's what we're going to know you as.
I was going to go easy on you, Bronwyn, but you're now the third garbage chute on this one.
Oh, really? Really, Nicholas?
Isn't there a song about that base load going down my spine?
Yeah, all right. Now, I want to do American politics. Just make it very quick, Nicholas, because we are like 12 minutes over. Be quick.
You are just a total socialist.
I've just got to go back to one argument you made, which we said we're just 1.3% of the world, so what's the point of us doing anything? There is no weaker or more morally bankrupt argument than that around this area.
It's not what he said. It's not what he said. No one's made that argument. No one has made that argument. No one has made that argument.
It's like saying...
He's pointed out the facts.
Here we go.
It's like saying don't donate to the bushfire relief funds because your little donation won't make a difference. If everybody acted like that, no one would do anything, the relief wouldn't come.
Yeah.
The whole world needs to do their share in tackling climate change. And all we're saying here is Australia should do its fair share.
I agree, but you're coming off an assumption China can continue to pollute at unlimited levels till 2030. The United States is not part of the international agreements. So I'm fine to do my bit, which is the Paris Accord. As 85% of the countries have signed an agreement, and that's the standard, all right? But it is very bizarre to me to suggest that you should pay twice the donations because your neighbour's not going to give a donation.
Well, hang on. So UK signed on to zero by 2050. Canada signed on. Japan signed on. Germany signed on.
India.
Most of the advanced world has signed on.
See, Nicholas...
Well, I'm open to that debate. So why are you saying this is the end of the world? Why are you doing Chicken Little on us?
Give us a go.
Chicken Little? You're telling us it's 20 times question mark.
The point here, Nicholas, is you've got to deal in facts. Now, you want to deal in emotion and all sorts of diatribes, and you misrepresent the science. The point is, you know that Paul and I have certainly supported Australia doing its bit because you've got to have some global action.
100%.
But don't try and pretend to people that's going to change the climate. The cost of doing that little bit is no benefit because you know that global emissions continue to rise by about double Australia's annual emissions. Secondly, you know that the most eminent climate scientists say that Australia's drought is not directly linked to climate change, yet you still try and blame the drought on climate change. You know also that we've had far worse bushfires killing more people as terrible as these were 20 years, 30 years, 50 years ago, yet you still try and use the bushfires to push a policy agenda. It's sad. We've just got to stick to the facts.